the honor to call upon stage Mr. Abraham Joseph, Chief Executive Officer, M2M Insights, and also the Chief Executive Officer of Device Management Forum. Sir is the founder and chairman of the Device Management Forum, an industry group formed to promote the interests of key stakeholders in the management of devices and associated services. He is also managing partner of Intelligentis, a boutique research and consulting group which he founded in 2001. In August 2010, he launched M2M Insights, a free news and information portal focused on M2M technologies and applications. He has over 20 years of experience in telecommunications and IT. Prior to founding the Device Management Forum and Intelligentis, Sir worked as consulting director at Ovum, and before that as director of consulting at Gartner. Sir has an MBA from the University of Strathclyde and a BSc in Electrical and Electronic Engineering from the Polytechnic of the South Bank. We welcome you, sir, to communicate well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Joseph is today going to talk on the topic Internet of Things, opportunities and challenges. Sir, we kindly request you to preside over the session.
Thank you. So, wow, where to begin? I guess, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to present here today. They said 20 years, and I don't believe it. You need to get a bit closer to see the gray hairs and the bags under the eyes and so on. So I've been around for a while, and it's quite interesting. Lots of themes we've been through here today. When I crafted the presentation, I was looking at sort of fused M2M and Internet of Things. But given the range of discussions we've had so far, what I'll do is I'll dip in and weave through very quickly and leave a lot of time at the end, I hope, for us to catch up with some questions. So my three hats were mentioned. You probably don't see a lot about this, but we do get invited to lots of things, and I'm looking forward to working with you here in terms of bringing some more insights to the market. So, definition, Internet of Things. Now, one of the fascinating things here is that there are all kinds of discussion about Internet of Things. You know, what does it mean? Is it, if you have a body area network, is it Internet of Things if it's not connected to the Internet? Is M2M the first phase of Internet of Things? I think to a large extent, here is a definition. Just before I came over here, actually, I was at a session in London where the European Commission were there with a number of UK trade and industry people looking at this. And this is the definition they have. As you can see, it's still somewhat devoid of people and the delivery of value to people. And to me, that's a challenge. So at the end of the day, we're talking about M2M, Internet of Things, and a range of associated technology, embedded connectivity, connected consumer, connected car, home, grid, whatever. I think what probably is very useful is to cut through all of that and look at what the impact, who might be interested and why. This is the view that the European Commission, with their kind permission, I'm presenting this slide. I'll move away from this towards the end, but it's useful for scene setting. So what we're talking about is basically a range of so-called smart environments, a range of underlying technologies and sensors and so on. And more importantly, this pervading just about every industry that we can think of. So when I present on this stuff, I usually try to go back to basics. What is this stuff anyway, and why should anybody be interested? So I've tried to if you could excuse the crude drawing for a minute, I tried to condense it to a few small sound bites. So here's one of the main things. Most carriers have this kind of problem. We all consuming YouTube increasingly on our iPhones, iPads, whatever. The subscriber numbers aren't necessarily keeping pace. And more importantly, subscriber revenues aren't necessarily keeping pace even with the subscriber numbers. So how do you address this disconnect? And of course, one of the things the carriers think would do it is M2M Internet of Things. Additionally, the number of consumers that you can sell SIM cards to is reducing. So in many markets, they're over 100% penetration. So once the if you like, the connecting people market has begun to saturate, it makes sense to connect machines. So the second main point to focus on here is the economics. We've hosted 2 events in China so far. One was at the end of 2010. The other one was in April this year. And the one point I'd like to make on this slide is that everybody's talking about Ericsson's 50 billion connected devices. In China, they were talking about 700 billion connected objects. And I think once you start looking at sensors in just about everything, the carpet knows where I am, etc., this lectern is embedded, then it's very easy to see how you can come up with those kinds of numbers. So anyhow, so the second point is that the race is on to connect machines after we've connected people. The third thing, and I think this is really crucially important, is that we are genuinely talking about the creation of, if you like, new mousetraps, genuinely better mousetraps. And this happens to be a real concrete case. A company called Wireless, the customer was Rent-A-Kill. They make rat traps. They spread them around the countryside. They catch the rats so the rats don't eat the crops. Now, in the old days, you spread your rat traps around the countryside. You send out a man or a woman in a van to empty the traps every day, every other day, every whatever. Today, this technology is now so cheap, it makes sense to put it in the rat trap. You know when a rat has been caught, you know when the rat is dead because you can monitor CO2, and lo and behold, you don't need to send anybody out this week because for whatever reason all the rats went that way and avoided your farm. So instead of talking about business process re-engineering, where we may be looking at moving around a couple of blocks of logistics, we are genuinely talking about transforming major industries with this technology. So that's the point I'd like to make here. So I think this has been mentioned already. If you look at Moore's law, price of chips and so on going down. But the point I'd like to stress on this side is that something in the creativity end is genuinely happening. So in the old days, maybe you needed a lot of money, maybe you needed to buy some hardware, maybe you needed a range of skills that you didn't have. Whereas now, anybody can rent some space on Amazon server, anybody can innovate in business model. So one of the supply-side drivers, to my mind, is, if you like, this creativity, entrepreneurship, and business model innovation. And similarly, lots of interesting things going on the demand side, but I shan't focus on those. You'll notice that I have some very busy slides. Partly, I don't have the polish of a large organization, but also partly, I've been dipping in and out of slide packs because there are quite a lot of interesting things going on. So, opportunities. Quite frankly, just about every industry you can think of is being transformed by this. Let's take a trivial example. It may be sensible to embed this lectern. Why? Because if you don't, at any given point in time, you have an important conference and you need to be sending people all over the campus trying to figure out where this lectern is. If it's cheap enough to do it and it makes enough sense, you embed the lectern. The minute it leaves this room, you know about it. So whether you look at retail, healthcare, sports and recreation, opportunities just about everywhere. Hardly any M2M presentation is complete without this Beecham research map. So let's move on. So how do you assess this opportunity? So you have all this massive spectrum of opportunities. Where do you put your money? So there have been lots of talk about, what's the revenue potential of automotive? What's the profit potential? What's the, as you look at these verticals, which one should you target first as operators? And there have been lots of discussion. I've been in about, maybe 10, 12 over the last several years, M2M, Internet of Things presentation. To me, let's go back a bit. To me, probably the most important way of looking at this is by stakeholder motivation. Who's going to do it? Who's going to pay for it and why? And some of the answers aren't necessarily what we might suspect. Let me give you an example. There may not be a compelling case for the consumer to pay for electric meters. Governments might not have the money to pay for electric meters. But somebody left of field maybe has an application that the consumer might respond to that may actually lead to the meters being paid for. Let's take another real example. The insurance industry is all over this stuff. Why? They believe they can become a lot more profitable. They believe they can write better policies. And in fact, it probably does make sense. They can say to me, actually, Mr. Joseph, we have to decline your claim for whiplash. In fact, the car behind didn't hit you. What happened is that you hit the car in front, and then the car behind hit you. They can actually and in fact, we have had some instances where insurance companies have gotten involved. So they have an interest, possibly, in kitting out the cars because it becomes more efficient for them to sell policies. So the point I'd like to make here is that we needn't necessarily look to the usual suspects to have some of these things, to see how these take off. And the final point here in terms of the overall scheme of things is we've moved away from talking about killer applications to realizing that what we're talking about is possibly a very long tail of viable applications. Maybe it makes sense to address just this particular little niche because it's profitable enough to do so. Okay. There are a couple of things that aren't usually referred to in this that I'd like to talk about here. White space radio. Who here is up to speed on what white space radio is? Surely there must be a few hands going up here. Okay, right. Definitely. Okay. So what's happening now? One of the things is that the chips are so clever. You can do so much clever things with software that if you've got little bits and pieces of spectrum around where you used to do television, it's now possible to knit that together. And the proponents of it say that the actual bandwidth you have available is something like over 100 megahertz, which is actually better than Wi-Fi. The second thing about it is that the characteristics, where it is, allows you to penetrate cellars and in buildings and under cupboards, where you might want to place meters, which 2G, 3G don't necessarily address. So very interesting space. There's a company called Newell in the UK that's doing some research around this. Microsoft, BBC, a lot of interesting companies backing that. Cell broadcast. Again, when you're looking at maybe devices that aren't necessarily fantastically clever, maybe there's some things you need to do that fire and forget. There's some interesting guys like One-to-Many who are working on that. And some of that is obviously part of the architecture that we need to look at going forward. And finally, big data analytics. Obviously, no need to mention this because we've heard a lot about this. So yes, we have all these fantastic opportunities. So what are some of the challenges? Quite a few of these have already been mentioned today as well. The forecasting job that has been, excellent job that has been done, talks about the fact that this debt impact may actually have in terms of the development market overall. And of course, it's going to have an impact on M2M Internet of Things. One area which we sort of touched on but probably haven't done, and I think in probably enough justice, is this business about the policy framework around some of this stuff. This stuff is moving at such a rate that to my mind, we're not necessarily keeping up. In fact, we in many cases, we are reacting after the horse is bolted. This is a big one. Privacy, security, trust. The trust one is particularly important. I was surprised to hear so much discussion about mobile device management earlier. That's a subject which, as you can imagine, is very close to my heart. And one of the big, hottest topics at the moment in that area is bring your own device. So somebody comes into the campus, they bring their iPad. Do you allow them to connect to the network? If you do, what are the implications? And some of what's happening is that it makes sense maybe to create a virtual environment in which you keep your corporate stuff safe, and they can do whatever they like on their side. But here's the issue. Would you, as an employee of corporate X, be necessarily trusting of the IT department to not necessarily look into your private space? So there are lots of issues in this area. And in particular, when you look at, if it's a person, if it's a mobile phone, usually you have some way of knowing when the thing was registered, knowing who it's associated with, and so on. When you start looking at devices, there may not be that loop where you can check who the device that's reporting or purporting to report is necessarily the one that you think it is. So lots of issues around that. And similarly, if I can sort of look at, back here. As you can see, I'm having challenges here with the initiative testing. Yeah, go here. Okay. On this side, at an industry level, the issue of standardization has been mentioned, but let me put another twist on the issue of standardization. In the old days, Nortel competed with, Alcatel competed with, Ericsson competed with, but nevertheless, there was an understanding that it made sense to come together to form standards, to collaborate on standards to advance the industry. Rising tide lifts all boats. That, to my mind, is not necessarily true these days. There are people coming completely left of field, completely vertical stacks, and capturing and decimating markets. This means that the traditional proponents of standards aren't necessarily as aggressively pursuing as they'd like. That's one issue. The second issue is, quite frankly, this stuff is moving so fast that the standards just cannot keep up. So, let me sum up on this side. On the standards side, the other issue relating to standards is this. We've been, by and large, talking about technical standards. What is a protocol for communicating a device? What's the architecture for managing all this big data stuff? We haven't necessarily been, and we've been largely looking at this M2M, Internet of Things bit, as separate from what's going on with the normal line of business of the enterprise. So to me, once you start linking these things real time, some of the enterprise frameworks, especially when you start going into specific verticals, become very relevant indeed. People like the Jericho Forum had done a lot of work around, identity. One of their big things was about deperimeterization. The idea that it's no longer possible for you to draw a nice fence around your organization and your interests because you're interacting with customers, with partners, and so on. And therefore, you have to go around architecting security in a slightly different way. This becomes even more relevant once you start looking at connected objects and worlds of connected objects. So, what I'm getting at here is that as we go forward, we'll probably start looking at a lot less about the technology of things, and in fact, some people have already mentioned some of these intellectual property and so on, and looking at some of the, if you like, the wider societal impacts of this, rather than the gee whiz aspects of the technology. So, how might this evolution occur? Well, there'll be consolidation. It's already happening in droves. There are, that's top bit here. Is anybody familiar with what this is? We need some exercise here to, no? I can't quite see. I hear some. Yes, absolutely. Okay. So this is a learning thermostat from a group called Nest Labs, and instead of people who left Apple. So the idea is you just stick this thing on your wall, $250, by the way. You stick it on your wall. When you're cold, you turn it up. When you're hot, you turn it down. And after it's there for a week or so, it starts learning your behavior. You don't necessarily need to do anything. They communicate with each other via Wi-Fi and so on. So one of the things that has yet to happen, and I'll explain why I refer to this particular one in a minute, is on the home front. We have all the bits and pieces there. We've had it for years. There have been several people attempting various bits, power line carrier, X10, but for some reason it hasn't come together. Now, one of the ways in which it might well come together is if, in fact, somebody who is not necessarily one of the traditional players actually comes in and makes some sense of it. Here's an example. I can't imagine a scenario where Apple makes a kettle or a toaster and the Apple fans do not necessarily buy it. Another area that's probably not often spoken about here is how do you actually engage the ecosystem? Now, various players have been having different attempts at it. This particular thing here, I'm not sure if the university here is doing anything with this, but this happens to be a reference design from Intel. It has just about every bit of radio stack you can think of on it. And in this particular case, they were showing how it can be used in a home automation context. So the message from this particular slide is what we're looking at is building an ecosystem from the ground up in order to make this thing happen. At the personal level, I don't know if anybody here has an Android watch yet, but one of the spaces that I think we are likely to see the consumer actually voting with his or her feet is actually going out and buying these things either because they are running fans or whatever. Okay, here's another quiz. What is this? Sorry? Yes, okay. Excellent. That man gets the prize. We here technologists. So by and large, we talk about the technology and so on. There's a set of people, there's a website called Council. And these guys are very much into the societal impacts of this. And they believe that one of the true benefits of all this stuff, when the dust settles, once all these business models and so on, what we're talking about is transforming the way we live. And they cite this kind of thing as an example. So instead of going to the shop to buy a toy or whatever, you have your own 3G printer, your own three-dimensional printer. You buy the design from whomever, and you basically print what you need at home. So as you push the envelope forward in terms of Internet of Things, what people are talking about is basically transforming society fundamentally, the way in which we make things, the way in which we distribute things, the way in which we interact with things. And they cite these developments, which are gathering quite a lot of momentum at the moment, as an example. Another example here is this modular hardware that Ford is using, Boggs Labs. I give this too, but one of the interesting things, and I'm not sure if anybody here is studying this, Kickstarter. It turns out that there are an awful lot, an accelerating number of M2M Internet of Things related projects getting funded on Kickstarter these days. Lots of discussions about cloud. So just a word on this for a minute. One of our new members is a company called Paulcast. And this guy worked for Apple. He worked for, in fact, he was responsible for the scalable architecture at Amazon. His name is Hong Bui. And what he has effectively come up with is a scenario that allows the consumer to build his own private cloud. Now, why am I talking about it in this context? Because the problem that's being solved is, by and large, similar to the problem that needs to be solved for some parts of the ecosystem relating to the enterprise and also relating to this M2M Internet of Things. So in this particular instance, you install this stuff on your PC at home or on campus. You don't necessarily need to put your information into the cloud. And what you can do is you can literally pick out any device and gain access to your content in real time. And they've done some very, very clever things. So Samsung and various other people like that are interested. But suffice it to say that cloud is very much an important part of this architecture. Let me give you another example. I went on a mission, a UK trade and industry mission to China. I think it was towards the middle of 2010, something like that. And, all people were very anxious to engage with the Chinese. What can we do for you? So somebody asked the question, what can we do? What can we help you? And they said, well, actually, I think we were expecting answers like, collaborate on R&D or whatever. They say, well, actually, the way we look at it is, the value chains are not complete. We see cloud as part of the picture. So, in other words, we had been, unfortunately, very guilty of looking at this in a very narrow way and what's happening over the next 2-3 years. They were thinking 15, 20 years ahead. And see cloud as part of this. I know I appear to be jumping in and out, but part of what I'm doing is to try to touch on the various themes that have been talked about earlier today. I think a point that was made in the last panel is maybe that we need to take a step back sometimes and not be too prescriptive in terms of our views of how some of these things may actually evolve over time. Now, here are a couple of examples. I use this quite a lot. The fact is, our thinking of the problem scope or the opportunity scope changes over time. Now, here are a couple of concrete examples. In the case of managing devices, the issue only came to the fore when 3G phones started rolling out in Japan. You had a population of phones out there, and the question is, what do you do with them if you have a bug? Recalling hundreds of thousands of phones becomes a real problem. But as operators invested in this thing, then it's about cost control, efficiency, customer care. And then finally, if you've got all this technology, why don't you use it to make some money and alter your proposition? Something similar happens in the security space. So if you look at networks in the old days, the only security concern was how do you stop people from making phone calls they shouldn't. Now roll forward to 2010, 2012, and you have all kinds of issues. Protecting the user. It's me. I've subscribed to that service. It's my iPad. But do you know at this instance in time, it's me actually accessing that dodgy service or my 10-year-old daughter? And how do you as an operator manage that? Now, it might sound a little far-fetched, but we had a case in the UK where teenagers were texting each other and then went and committed suicide, some of them. So the government got BT, Vodafone, Zilot into a room to try and bash heads together. How dare you allow people to use your phones to text and then go commit suicide? So as an operator, and by the way, how many operators do we have in the room? None? Oh, one. So as an operator, you'd find that there are all manners of issues suddenly appearing on your table as a result of the way in which people may or may not use or abuse some of these technologies. So moving on. So I've talked a bit about the opportunities. I've talked a bit about what some of the threats are. So who might win in some of this? Well, the good news, Mr. Operator, is we believe that you do have a role to play. We believe that some of that market, a good part of the market, is yours to lose, basically. And the reason is because of some of what we're talking about involves licensed spectrum, and you're still kingmaker in that. You've paid for your spectrum. However, you're not necessarily going to have it all your own way, because if this thing if this white space technology takes off, there are plenty of people who say, well, it's quite amusing. We started hosting a series of workshops, and one of the people there was Fred Harrison, the chairman of Open Mobile Alliance, and he's head of advanced technology at O2. And it was he who had to remind the audience that televisions don't move around very much. So in reality, as far as home electronics is concerned, consumer electronics, Wi-Fi is probably very, very much good enough for any of these things we are talking about. We're beginning to see the IT gatekeepers really coming to the fore. And I highlight China. Now, it was quite interesting to listen earlier to issues in India versus the rest of the world. I happen to believe that India probably has some similar potential to China, simply because at the end of the day, we are talking about delivering value to end consumers, and consumers willing to pay for value. That, to me, India has probably as much as China does. But China is important for a number of reasons. One is they are very serious about this stuff and have written it literally into the current 5-year plan. And are definitely thinking very, very far ahead in terms of the way they actually go around architecting some of these things. So the first event we had in 2010, we had China Mobile explaining what they were doing in terms of the airport, monitoring pollution, all kinds of things. This time round, the main takeaway for me in April was that having looked at all of this stuff, they're concluding that they need to build a separate network. So rather than look at getting extra value out of the infrastructure they've already put in place, they're actually talking about building separate networks for M2M. So I'll just go, and of course some of these numbers in terms of the size of the consumer, the middle class, growing middle class, the size of the market. And of course China has as much a problem as the rest of us around things like, if you take healthcare, I've seen a figure of something like 250 million people over 65. A growing number of people, shrinking budgets to look after them. And that's why, if you ask the people who are spending money in this space which sectors they'll bet on, a number of them say healthcare, but they see it as quite a thorny issue. So I now want to just look at the issue of device management in the context of some of what we've been talking about. So a couple of things. Device management is necessary. If you have any service, mobile advertising, games, whatever, if your service happens to use a device, you ought to be interested in this stuff because it's a fundamental layer that needs to sit below whatever it is you're doing as a business on the device. The second aspect of device management in this context, which, as I said, it happens to be one of the thorniest problems in M2M and Internet of Things, is that the devices and classes of devices are becoming the window into which you actually view the entire opportunity space and the entire management of all of these technologies. So if you like, there are interweaved layers relating to management of devices in all of this. So a little bit about a device management forum. Interestingly, the presence people see of us is basically the portal. In reality, we started that only to help members keep up to date with the news. Suffice it to say that these days a lot of people are very interested because we've been running interviews and so on, so I'd very much like to interview the thought leaders amongst you here. We're also interested in partnerships because people would like us to do various studies of the market, segment the market, and some of the good work you've been doing here. We'd like to work with you on that. We also get calls for people to speak at international events and so on. So those of you who are interested in that, talk to us, and we'll be happy to help facilitate you getting the knowledge you have onto a wider stage. M2M Insights. This is very much a beta project, but the idea is to focus in a little bit more tightly on the specific opportunities in these segments. And one of the things we have the ability to do, and you may be, a number of you here may be interested in this, is say, for example, somebody believed that, and I use this example with Telenor, and it turns out that they did have a case. If you happen to believe that bird watching is an important segment for M2M Internet of Things, we have the ability to work with you to create a new channel for that and so on. And as it turns out, people have that kind of need. What we've been doing these events like in China. We started a series of workshops, evening workshops, and I've just started to basically experiment with meetups. So maybe we can look at having a meetup on campus sometime in the not too distant future. We have been doing the M2M thing in China. We'd very much like to do one in India, and we have been discussing that with a number of partners. Here's a concrete example of something we did. I don't know if anybody recognizes this man. He is Professor Candy, who's Global CTO of Hutchison 3. What we did in that particular occasion was to look at, bring together stakeholders in the service provider space, such as him, Fred Harrison, as I mentioned earlier, people within the enterprise space, and people within the traditional M2M Internet of Things, to look specifically at the issue of management and security. What is converging? What do we really need to look at? And there was some very interesting outcome from that session. If anybody wants to know about it, we can speak offline. Very busy slide here on the conclusions, but the bottom line is this. There are a number of key drivers. It is beyond hype. We're talking about genuine creation of new mousetraps, new business, and that's supported both by new technology and by new processes and by new possibilities enabled by cloud services. The operators have a role to play. The question would be, to what extent do they step up to the plate and actually take that, or to what extent do they allow others to steal a march? And the reason they have that role is because of licensed spectrum. At the end of the day, this is a scale game, right? We're talking about billions of devices, billions of sensors, so economies of scale do play. And it's interesting, I used to go around saying, wait till Huawei, wait till Ericsson enters. And just before I left the UK, Huawei made an announcement about a big M2M initiative in Europe. So that's not to say that the small guys do not necessarily have a chance. What it means is that you do need to be a lot smarter, a lot nimbler, and thank goodness there is a possibility to do that. So that's about as much from me at this point. And I'd very much like to welcome some questions. Device management, M2M, Internet of Things. Happy to answer. Okay. You'd have to catch me offline. Oh, sorry. Sure.
Hi, my name is Akbar, and I work for Vodafone. Out of the different industry segments that you mentioned, which industry segment you think will adopt M2M and ITU faster than the other? This is question one. Second question which I have for you is, as you mentioned, business models will evolve. So have you seen? Can you give any example where business model is in a fairly mature shape, and you can share the details with us?
Okay. The answer to the first question about segments is that it depends market by market. In Europe, we have some initiatives around smart meters, so Italy, for example. It also depends on the attitude of governments. Brazil had made some announcements about ensuring that every car sold beyond a certain date is fitted so that it can be tracked and traced. So there are opportunities in all of these segments. The question is, how do these opportunities get primed, and who actually stands to gain? I know, for example, at Vodafone, you guys are doing a lot of exciting things in the automotive space with BMW and so on in Germany. Healthcare, I think, is probably going to be one of the biggest. If we look, 5 years on, 7 years on, 10 years on, I think healthcare would be pretty massive. In the nearer term, I believe there's some opportunities around consumer electronics where the consumer is willing to pay for certain things.
So you mentioned that there are opportunities across the industry segments. Each industry segment is structured differently. Like pharma has a different structure, retail has its own challenges. So if you look at the structure of the different industry segment, which one is more suitable or which one is more adaptable?
Okay. Now, this is interesting because some markets, by their very nature, are multi-domestic. And some markets probably are more amenable to the sort of footprint that, say, Vodafone has, for example. And to be honest, I think the jury is still out on that. If you look at health is clearly something that's very much multi-domestic. If you look at something like automotive, then obviously you don't want things to change from the minute you drive from Belgium to France. So I know that Vodafone has invested a lot in that. Meter reading, energy management, lots of potential, likely to need government support. Things that are involving the consumer have a greater propensity to have international and possibly global appeal. So if I were somebody looking at building something that had mass consumer appeal, like, I don't know, heart rate monitoring or something that integrates with a person, I would be looking at global markets. And I think there are some substantial opportunities there in relation to the consumer space. I think it's a very complicated issue, and you need to sort of peel the layers instance by instance. I'm not sure whether I did any justice to the question.
Ideas, I think what you are saying is, the industry segments, for example, you mentioned the meter reading and all, the ones which are likely to get support from the, regulatory bodies and the government, those are likely to move faster than others. And where, there are regulatory complications like, the consumer segment and all, I think those things will go slower, and they will wait for others to mature.
Yes, with one provisor, and that is, there are instances where, if you look, for example, at the Samsung Smart TV, and if you look at what they're doing in terms of integration with the devices and so on, it's entirely conceivable that 3 or 4 years from now, either Samsung or Apple might have solved and cornered the consumer electronics space, so that when you buy your next washing machine, you make sure that it's got a Samsung interface or whatever. So I think there's a potential for some large players with either muscle or the brand equity to actually go out and do so and prime some markets.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for such a thought-provoking session. I request you to take your seat on the stage. Please. Now, I would like to request my colleague to present sir with a memento as a token of our gratitude and appreciation.